welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Turn the Page. I'm your host, Jen, and I am joined by the creator behind an absolutely gorgeous work of graphic history, dealing with American history and some really interesting strains in both women and race relations. So let's get right to it. Welcome to the show. Could I ask you to introduce yourself and your book, please?
Sure. I'm Caitlin Cass, and the book is Suffrage Song, The Haunted History of Gender, Race, and Voting Rights in the U.S. It documents the history of the suffrage movement from 1848, the Seneca Falls Convention, through the Civil War and the turn of the century to the passage of the 19th Amendment, and then onwards to the Civil Rights Movement and all the work that was done to get voting rights for people of color. And it uses ghosts as well as a visual metaphor for the ongoing unfinished business of that history. And really I really enjoy the history of visual culture. So there's also like a lot of typography and prints that are satirical kind of riffs on historical imagery from these different time periods.
Yeah, it takes on so much and it organizes it all so well and makes it really accessible while not, being overly simplified, if that makes sense. Before we get into the book too much itself, I'd love if you could talk a little bit about your journey towards illustration, towards comics. What drew you to making art about what your website says, quote unquote, failing systems and irrational hope, which I love.
Sure. So I would say I always liked to tell stories. My mom would help me make little visual books when I was a kid. She was a reading teacher. But I kind of thought I'd be an author or just like a prose author or an academic. And then I went to school for great books. And I kind of, in that very Western canon focused space, started to realize that I just didn't feel as free there as I did in drawing and making things. So I decided to move over to comics, a place where it just felt freer to talk about history and ideas, because there wasn't that like long lineage of people doing it, and there weren't certain standards of what it was supposed to be. And I would say I got more into women's history when I started teaching at an all girls and non-binary school, a private high school, after I went to graduate school for art and visual studies. And I started this project as a celebration for the suffrage centennial, so 2020, and it just kept growing. It was part of an exhibition in 2020, and then I just kept adding to it, and it became this book. So.
Wow. I'm really glad that you mentioned the exhibit, because a lot of your work has also sort of been accompanied by exhibits, whether they're online or sort of traveling physical collections or static physical collections. Could you talk a little bit about like how the exhibits maybe like play a role in your process? Like, does it help you, like process the material and organize your thinking?
Yeah, I feel like it really helps me organize my thinking. I often start with an image. Like, it's easier for me to encapsulate broad ideas without kind of oversimplifying by just depicting it in an image. And I like moving between mediums, almost like I'm building my own archive of things to kind of like activate my mind and other people's minds in that space, so you can make connections without being sort of told what connections to make, which I tried to sort of keep in the final book to some degree. You want there to be a narrative, so it's this like thin line of like how scattered. You don't want it to be too episodic and scattered, but it's moving between mediums just feels like a more natural way to think. And as I'm starting my next project, I'm kind of thinking about the history of like ecofeminism and environmentalism, and I'm like starting to read about this idea of like tentacular thinking and this systems thinking and needing to think of in wholes. it's making me feel like reassured about these choices that I make about creating these art exhibits kind of on the way to a larger narrative, because I think that this web-like way of thinking is maybe something that we should be doing more.
Hmm. Yeah, and that kind of speaks to something that you talk about very early in the book, in your reflective first chapter, which I thought was so interesting, about how, history and the archive has these gaps, and like rather than trying to kind of like create wholeness where it doesn't really exist, like allow those gaps to speak. And I think that that's like a really interesting way of handling that problem.
Yeah, I want it to leave room for um people to want to build on it themselves too, just like any historian. Like my favorite parts of those histories often like people acknowledging, as I was reading and researching, acknowledging places where the work still needs to be done, right? And this like larger community of trying to discover and being part of that intellectual history of building the history of women and marginalized groups and people of color, I think. And so I guess that was something I wanted to preserve. Yeah.
Very cool. So, yeah, I'd love to talk about how you combine your historical research with comics. I think we're like actually in a really nice moment for graphic history. Like, I think we're seeing a proliferation and we're seeing a lot of different types of stories being told. What's interesting to me is that like there's like a little bit of different let's say goals in those two strategies. Like history's job is often to make things like more complicated, more nuanced, to like expand stories and blow them out. And comics can often be about streamlining and minimalism and like trying to have like the most efficacy or efficiency in getting your point across. So like how do you balance those two like sort of like drives, I guess, or like how does that shape sort of how you tell your story?
Yeah, that's so hard. That's like such a big question.
I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. It's a great question. I try to balance it. I think one of the things is, a lot of times you see graphic histories and they're very much like this so and so for dummies, right? Like the whole point is to make it like very simple and pared down. And that like has never been my intention. I see comics as a medium to explore ideas like any other. And so for me, it's really just a way to like keep researching and learning myself. And hopefully that's useful to other people. And as somebody who, has a master's degree in visual studies, but not a PhD, like obviously the level I'm thinking at might be more accessible to a wider audience more easily. But so I think that's helpful. But it is very much like the personal is political, and it's just me as who I am kind of trying to interrogate my own prejudices and better understand the history I'm coming from and the reasons some of these ideas are hard to kind of keep in mind. Just like the racism throughout the women's suffrage movement, like trying to wrap my brain around that and understand it better.
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting because yeah, like history often is thought of as like telling a story, and stories have like finite meanings and stuff like that, and like you can fix meanings to them. But like history as a conversation, like between historians or between generations or between like people in a movement is like has less what is it, like closure to it, right? So like it's really kind of also like again grappling with that like complexity, which I think just comes across like so nice on the page.
Yeah, that complexity like is so overwhelming.
Yeah.
Yeah, is constantly just finding new things all the time that I wish I could have included in the project. Like, so as I'm traveling in support of the book, every time I go to a new city, I'm trying to research a suffragist from that place or a civil rights activist and just draw them and learn about them so it doesn't stop, because there's just so much left,
Yeah.
that's there to be discovered.
Oh, how cool. Yeah, so let's turning more to the book specifically, it is an extraordinarily relevant topic at the moment, I think, because we're at a moment of grappling with gender and race and all sorts of really complicated intersections. So I'd love if you could talk a little bit about like what your research was like, and if there was anything that you found like in your research process that really changed like your perception of the story that you were telling.
Mhm. Well, I guess from the very start, I started 2020, like the beginning of the pandemic hit right as I was beginning the project. And so certainly, like I already always knew it was going to be important to me to include women of color in this narrative. But I don't think I had any idea it was going to end up focusing so much on racism. And it definitely came out of the current moment with George Floyd and everything. And that made me pivot towards trying to focus more on unpacking that history. I think like a big thing was that beyond just getting started on it, once the actual centennial happened, or as it approached, there were more and more sources, right? So like suddenly, because of this government funding, because other funding to support the centennial of the suffrage amendment, all of this new research was being published, and I was able to include that in the book. And so like when I started and I would type in like racism within the suffrage movement, there were only a handful of things. And of course, this was sort of added to by the fact that I got an academic job and started teaching at a university. I teach at the University of Nebraska, Omaha. And so I had more, I was able to access more sources instead of like just JSTOR. I had all of these different journals and books and stuff. But I think it was also just because when you look at the publication dates, just all these books being published. So specifically, there's like stories about Mary Church Terrell, and Standing Up to Alice Paul, which was, I think, from Martha C. Jones' American Vanguard book about Black women within the suffrage movement. There were there were two new biographies published about Fannie Lou Hamer while I was working on this project. So like I couldn't have written the sections on Fannie Lou Hamer to the same extent at all without those. Yeah, so I thought that was just really, because it related so much to the history of women's suffrage, like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, when they were fundraising, and just the amount that like not having money sort of deteriorated the movement, right? And the fact that they couldn't actually own the money was making it even harder. So I think it's important to kind of acknowledge that. It's interesting to think about how that
Yes.
continues to be true.
Totally. Yeah, there's so much to consider about sort of like both the importance of solidarity to these movements and also like the sort of the problems that like they had sort of like achieving that, and just like the complicated nature of these figures, because like there were some things that they would be considered today still very progressive about, and others that seem like really retrograde, and finding solidarity across race lines seemed to be really hard for a lot of these like white women who sort of were very limited in their views. So yeah, could you talk a little bit about, telling these stories about figures that were very important to you, as you mentioned, but having to grapple with their legacies in a totally different way?
I think the biggest thing, like in the introduction, I talk a little bit about like a figure like Carrie Chapman Catt, who is very much a political opportunist and would say whatever the audience wanted to hear. Definitely traces of like social Darwinism in the reasoning a lot of these women, especially at the turn of the century, where they believed in progress. They believed in this idea of, eugenics to some degree, and that the people of all races might be able to be uplifted, but there was still like an order that was supposed to be there. And those kind of ideas were being used strategically to certain audiences in order to get the vote. Right. So she tapped into the racism in certain communities in order to push for women's suffrage, and sometimes claiming that the women would help vote against or vote for bills that would reinforce racist systems. Right. And so I that was a lot to just navigate with, and I think still very much relevant today is just thinking about the ways certain political agendas are put forward and others are not, because that political opportunism is necessary in order to get elected.
Yeah, you do see a lot of like the sort of the conflict between like ideals and like what you might call real politics. That still feels like very modern and just as relevant today. Um, I'd love if we could talk a little bit about like the physical book itself. It is absolutely beautiful in its design, classic, Fantagraphic, beautiful, beautiful aesthetics. Could you talk a little bit about that process and some of the decisions to let's say like enhance the book? Like I love the fold outs. I love the use of color to denote like different time periods and all sorts of stuff like that. Could you talk about that?
Sure. Um, well, so for starters, once the book was done, like I printed all the pages out and hand bound a volume that had those fold outs in it. And I did the cover with the silver ink and I made a slip case for it and I sent it to them. And that's like, I didn't have an actual, like we had a verbal agreement, but they wouldn't give me a contract. So that was me asking for it and it worked. And
Nice.
then they said they would do it. So, Fantagraphics is, always saying that they want to support artists' visions like front to back, which is really amazing. It can be difficult because the artist has to like create the whole thing and then send it to them versus like working with an editor to try to get it done. But I think something that really needs to be celebrated because they agreed to do the gold foil. They were like one-upping me on all the foldouts by making sure they were all different, like I had a gatefold and then like a vertical fold, and they were like, we got to add a map, so we added a big map that folded out in four. And yeah, so it was really fun. Kayla E helped to make all those things actually function, and the editor Conrad, yeah, was very encouraging about it, so it was pretty cool.
Yeah, it is. It's absolutely beautiful. And as you were talking, it kind of occurs to me that like it has a nice sort of like complementary nature to like the pictures of your exhibits that I've seen online because they're also like very tactile and interactive and it like recreates that feel a little bit.
Yeah, that's the hope. I really loved the Postman books, like with the letters that folded out. They're kids' books. The
Mhm.
Jolly Postman. You know those?
Yes.
I practiced. I was at a comic show and I mentioned it to a librarian, and they were like, "Those are the bane of our existence," because, like, they lose all of the pieces. But mine they don't come out all the way, at least. But yeah, so that was something I was thinking about. But yeah, also trying to preserve that artifacty feel, that sort of wonder you get when you're sort of flipping through physical objects. I
Mhm.
got to go to a lot of women's history archives. Uh, Went to Vassar College and flipped through a bunch of like original letters between Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, and saw the suffrage memorabilia. And I just really wanted to preserve that experience because there's something like magical about feeling like you're touching these real things that were there at the time. So,
Yeah, it
yeah.
captures a little bit of that joy of like historical discovery and being in the archives and like happening upon just like a cool physical document. So yeah, the whole thing is like a really lovely intellectual experience and aesthetic experience. And thank you so much for sharing it with us.
Yeah, thank you for reading it.
Oh, no problem. So what's next for you? Are you working on anything at the moment?
Yeah, I've been sort of diving deep into ecofeminism. I've been reading Carolyn Merchant, The Death of Nature,
Ooh.
and just learning about the relationship between, the prejudice against women and women as resources, like the natural environment was co-opted as a resource. So I'm going to work on a book and exhibition about that. So also about the historical depictions of disasters. So I'm hoping to look at a bunch of old lithographs and stuff and try to make satirical lithographs, and just the way that people in this country and around the world related to capitalism and industry became kind of oddly preoccupied with disaster
Yes. Oh,
and
that is.
selling and buying images of disaster. And I don't know how it's all going to coalesce yet, but I'm having a lot of fun. It's the
Ooh.
best part of the project where you get to like have it be about everything and then you have to like narrow.
That is the fun part, yeah, where you have total freedom. You're like, I don't have to worry about making a story of this. I'm just reading. It's great.
Mhm. So I've done a couple comics on disaster postcards because that was where I first found these pictures of historical oil fires.
Oh,
And so
wow.
I worked in short comics first. So I'd have a mail order comic that people subscribe to, and I mailed them out every other month. So these are like mini comics. So they're anywhere between like 8 and 24 pages. But so I'm building the project there, and eventually I'll have to not just do it there, but there's been a couple. I also did one about Ida Tarbell, its relationship to work, and then her origin story of growing up near the oil fields in Pennsylvania. So.
Wow. That is fascinating. I am really fascinated with those postcards. Like, it seems so weird to take a picture of an oil fire and then be like, "Hi, Mom. I hope you're doing
Yeah,
well."
totally.
Yeah.
It's like, I mean, I guess at the time, it was a way to share what you witnessed or what you were near, the disaster that you were near.
Mm.
And it was also, they were sold kind of like news, like they were sold at stores, but like for a little bit more than a newspaper. And as I'm finding the research like of these fires and stuff, it's like hard to tell if people actually hung them in their homes or not, but it's people speculate that maybe it was more to like share this experience that you were there for.
Oh, wow. Well, I hope you don't mind if I get in touch to talk about that too, like when
Oh,
that
that would be awesome.
because
Yeah.
that sounds great. Well, yeah, thank you so much again for joining us. This has been really lovely.
For having me. This is great. I want to listen more to this podcast. So
Thank you. Okay, listeners, it's your turn now. Please check out Suffrage Song, The Haunted History of Gender, Race, and Voting Rights in the USA. It's a really beautiful book, and you're going to learn a lot from it. You're hearing this in early December. It probably makes a really beautiful holiday gift. So think about that for your loved ones who love history and comics. All right, everybody, it's time to close this chapter. We'll see you next time.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.